He thought he had it all figured out. He left his wife, emptied the bank account, and ran off to Miami with a younger woman, ready for a new life, a fresh start. But what he never expected was that the game he started was one he could never win. Because while he was busy celebrating his escape, something was happening behind the scenes. Something that would turn his dream life into a nightmare. And now, he's got nothing, no money, no allies, nowhere to run. And the only person who can save him is the woman he betrayed. But will she?
Mark had always felt himself to be a man in charge of his own fate. He took great satisfaction in his capacity to shape events to his advantage, to negotiate problems, to create reality into whatever fit him best. He had lived his life believing he was always the one setting the rules, always the sharpest guy in the room, always the one in charge. And he felt he had planned the ideal escape when he chose to divorce Sarah. He went out the door without second thought. Months of preparation had gone into this moment, carefully siphoning funds from their shared accounts little by bit to bury his tracks, with just enough care to prevent suspicion. He had already scheduled his ticket, had promised the woman awaiting him in Miami a fresh life, a woman younger, more vibrant, someone who saw him as unique. He left behind an empty bank account and just a brief, cold message. He saw Sarah finding it, her disbelief, uncertainty, sadness. The notion of her feeling helpless, abandoned, left to gather the fragments of a life he had destroyed without thinking twice delighted him. Miami greeted him with wide arms. Or at least that was how it felt. His weight from former life vanished the moment he came. The sun was warm. The water seemed to go on forever before him, and his young lover hung on his arm, as though he were the only man on the planet. He lavishly rented a pricey condo with a view of the water, ate at upscale restaurants, purchased designer gifts for the woman he now referred to as his future. Every swipe of his card, every opulent treat seemed like evidence he had done the right thing. He had prevailed. He was free now. But what he did not know, what he never could have predicted, was Sarah had been observing him all along. She had awareness, not only about the affair, but also about the money, about the falsehoods, about every tiny thread he had pulled free while creating his ideal escape route. She had seen the signals, the far-off looks, the covert late-night texts, the way he touched her like she was under obligation rather than free will. Sarah was not the kind of lady to overlook what was there in front of her, or to ask a man to stay when he had already made up his mind to go. She had instead waited. She had participated, allowing him to create the fiction of his leaving free from intervention, thereby enabling him to believe he was the one in charge. But behind his back, she had been arranging the elements for something far more terrible than heartache. She began with the money first. Mark had been cautious, or so he had believed. He had opened secret new accounts and moved Sarah's savings to locations she was never meant to find. Sarah, though, had access to everything. Every password, every transaction, every financial technique he claimed he knew. And she quickly turned it all around. He did not notice straight away. Everything first seemed to be in good shape. He continued to spend, kept savoring the high of his fresh life, kept reveling in the false triumph. He felt the first twitching of discomfort, just after a dinner bill bounced back unpaid. That had to be a mistake. Then, though, it happened once again at the hotel. His card dropped. His gut twisted. He tested still another. Lost. He pulled out his phone, excused himself, entered into his bank accounts with the assurance of a man expecting to find a little fortune waiting for him. His blood turned to cold when he saw instead his bank account lacked $5 as well. He refreshed the page. Once only. Twice. Third time around. Not once modified. Every one of the accounts was empty. He had so painstakingly stolen money that vanished completely. His heart throbbed in his ears as he searched for answers, phoning the bank in a frenzy, and then was faced with icy, objective words. Frozen assets, illegal transfers, legal holds. Though deep down he already knew, he tried to debate and figure out how this could have happened. Sarah has done this. Sarah had watched it all unfold, piece by piece, exactly as she had planned. The stolen money? Gone. His lies? Exposed. The perfect life he thought he had built crumbled into nothing. But tell me, what would you have done in her place? Would you have let him go, let karma take its course? Or would you have taken matters into your own hands, just like Sarah did? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm dying to know. Now, let's see how Mark handles the consequences. His mistress saw his almost instantaneous panic. She was seeing the self-assured, confident man she had fallen for disintegrating. Promising everything would be good, he sought to hide it, shrugging off the financial catastrophe as a minor mistake. But Sarah had also got ready for this. That night the email showed up. Curious opening it, his mistress discovered her world breaking all around her. Her appetite dropped just from the subject line. The truth about Mark, proof of the pilfered money, documentation of earlier relationships, receipts of presents he had purchased for other women before her, even letters he had sent to another lady just weeks before she fled. Sarah had said it all out. One could not have any questions about it, not even a place for denial. Over and over he had been playing the same game, promising, weaving lies, using women as stepping stones to his next trip. She vanished first thing in morning. She had not confronted him, or given him the gratification of a debate. She had just left the condo key on the table, packed her bags, and vanished. The flat was silent when Mark woke up, deafening. He picked her up on phone. No response. Desperate, he sent texts seeking to explain, trying to turn the truth into something more appetible. None. She disappeared, and she was not returning. He had nothing left. Not able to pay, the hotel kicked him out. His renting deal fell apart. The opulence that had enveloped him vanished overnight, leaving him marooned in a city that had felt like paradise, but now seemed like a jail. He was nowhere to escape. He had no one to ask. Desperate, he performed the one action he said he never would have. He picked up Sarah. The phone let out a ring. Once, twice more, 10 times. None of a response. He gave it another go. Still another. He texted her, alternately expressing guilt, wrath, regret, imploring her to meet with him to explain, rectify whatever she had done. Sarah had moved on though already. She had deleted him exactly as he had tried to do with her. Mark had turned aside thinking he had prevailed. He had believed he was the one running the game, the genius, the one leaving Sarah broken and vanquished in his wake. But the result had already been written from the time he had decided to turn on her. He had never been in charge. Sarah had seen the board long before he had ever taken up the first piece. Ultimately, it had never been a game he could win either. Mark had never gone through actual desperation before. He had dabbled with the thought of struggle, flirted with it, but always with the unwavering belief he would prevail. It was who he was, the man who could talk his way into fortune, into power, into love, and out of any circumstance. Now though, he felt something he had never experienced lying on the brink of a motel bed covered in roaches with his head in his hands. Weakness. Everything has vanished. The money, the luxuries, the power he had accrued during years of development, once a byword for success. His name meant nothing today. His old colleagues had ghosted him. His so-called buddies had turned their backs. And even the women who used to toss themselves at him no longer answered the phone. Sarah had followed through on this. She had practically totally ruined him, so precisely that he could not understand how she had done it. He had undervalued her. That turned out to be his worst error. He had treated her like a moron, a woman too stupid with love to notice the wall's inscription. Still, she had been observing. She had been on wait. She had also quickly pulled the rug out from under him when the moment was right, still unable to catch her breath. Before, Mark had never been poor. He had never known the sort of hunger that tore at a man's ribcage, the kind of tiredness that made every step seem like trudging through quicksand. But he was starting to know what it meant to be really broken, after days of aimless roaming around Miami, with just a virtually dead phone and the clothing on his back. His last night in the motel was spent staring at the ceiling, while the neon glow from the vacant sign outside fluttered periodically through the window. The manager had issued an ultimatum, pay or go. The man had only laughed, bored, as he had tried to buy time and smooth his way into an extension. Mark had been ordered to leave the following morning. He was walking onto the streets with nowhere to go, and no one left to call upon. Once a playground, the city seemed like a jail now. He tried phoning in favor requests. The guys who used to respect him today hardly noticed he existed. The women who used to fall for his lies had all heard the tale. Sarah had confirmed this. Even his former business associates had turned away, cautious of being around a man whose collapse had been so public and embarrassing. He had stopped striving after the third day, spending his hours in parks observing people go by. He wondered whether any of them had ever experienced this sort of failure before. He considered himself as unbeatable, someone who could never be really defeated. But he was realizing the terrible reality now. Sarah had not merely grabbed his money, she had adopted his moniker, his repute, his capacity for manipulation, dishonesty, climbing his way back up. She had eliminated the one thing that had made him dangerous, and she had left him with just the debris of the guy he once was. Mark experienced fear, first in his life, real crippling terror. He also knew there was just one place left to travel to. Sarah is here. He was unsure about his expectations from her. He might have sought retribution. Possibly he sought atonement. Perhaps he simply wanted to find out whether she still cared enough to gloat personally. Whatever it was, he couldn't get rid of the impression that just now only she could save him. Knowing it was a one-way excursion, he paid for a bus ticket with the remaining crumpled bills in his pocket. Miami would not be the target of a return. There wouldn't be a second shot. The trip back seemed to last more than the flight had carried him away. Sitting near the window, he could see the kilometers fly by. His reflection was hardly discernible in the glass. Now he was leaner. His face was skinny from days without enough food. Previously immaculate, his clothing were soiled and wrinkled. He exuded the man who had been through hell. Furthermore, in many respects he had. The bus had long passed midnight by the time it entered town. Perhaps it was simply that he no longer had the same presence in the city that he had known. The streets were quieter than he remembered. He walked these roads as though he owned them. He moved now as though a ghost. Sarah lived in the same house. The porch light was on, throwing a cozy glow against the night. Standing there and staring at the door he had formerly passed countless times without thinking seemed strange. He was hesitant. Mark had no words for the first time in his life. He knocked then, before he could lose his composure. Sharp against the silence of the night was the sound. He waited as his palms sweated and his heart hammered. Then the door opened, following what seemed to be an eternity. Barefoot, Sarah stood there with a baggy sweatshirt slung over one shoulder. Her attitude was incomprehensible. She seemed not startled to see him. She had been looking forward this. Mark tried to find the words by hard swallowing, but nothing materialized. Sarah bent her head slightly to examine him. She said at last, "Too late. You look absolutely awful." Her voice was serene, nearly amused. Not irate, not triumphant, simply knowledge. Mark exhaled the breath he had not noticed he had been holding. He was hardly able to remain upright. "I have to talk," he replied, his voice rough. "Please," said. Sarah hardly moved for a moment. She sighed, then turned aside to hold the door open. Mark stopped just once to then stroll in, and he experienced something he hadn't felt in a long time, first since he had left. Hopes.
Mark thought Sarah was weak. He believed he could erase her from his life without consequences. But she waited, she planned, and she made sure he lost everything. And if you think that's ruthless, wait until you hear what happens next. In the next story, a man who believed his empire was untouchable made the biggest mistake of his life, underestimating the one person who could truly destroy him, his own daughter. And when she came back, it wasn't to save him. It was to end him. Don't miss this. Click now to watch.